With the latest agriculture news from across the state and nation, it's time for the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. Here's your host, Sabrina Halvorson.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us today on the AgNet News Hour. Coming up later, we have this week's Almond update with Brian German, but to start out today, we're focusing on livestock, and more specifically, the issues facing cattle producers here in the western U.S. And for that, we're going to turn it over to the experts at the National Cattlemen's Beef Association.
I'm Hunter Ehrman, and today we're catching up with Sigrid Johannes, Director of the Public Lands Council and NCBA Government Affairs. Sigrid, there's always a lot going on in the climate and natural resources space. One of the things I'd like to talk about first is the sage grouse management plans that have been released from the BLM. Could you give us an update on what's going on there?
Thanks for having me, Hunter. So the last time these plans were updated was 2019. Before that, there was a pretty significant revision in 2015. And like a lot of things in the natural resources, and particularly the wildlife space, the sage-grouse management plans have become kind of a football from one administration to the next. What we're seeing this year is the Biden administration's stamp on this issue, their attempt to kind of make their own mark and carve their own strategy out for how they want to manage this species moving forward. And there's a lot of eyes on this for a number of reasons. The first one is that the sage grouse is a very iconic Western species of bird. The greater sage grouse pops up in multiple Western states. It's a native species of the sagebrush steppe, which is one of the kind of ecosystems or biomes, as we say, that is very foundational to landscapes across the western United States, and it's considered a keystone species. So when sage-grouse decline, conservationists look into that and read into that there's all kinds of other things going downhill in the ecosystem. So it's an interesting one to watch. It's kind of a marker for folks to watch, and that's why there's such a great interest in conserving it and conserving its habitat in the sagebrush. Where cattle enters into this and ranchers is that there's been a big push from environmentalists to kind of hijack this very well-meaning effort to conserve the sage-grouse and use it to remove grazing from federal lands. This is the same playbook that we see with all kinds of species. It's nothing new, unfortunately. But when it comes to the sage-grouse, like many species, we actually have very good science to support the fact that cattle and this bird can coexist. And in many cases, cattle actually improve habitat for this bird. So that's kind of what the relevance is. And there's a lot in these plans to dig into. It's a really lengthy proposal with pretty far-reaching impacts for millions of acres across the West.
So this is pretty new. Talk about what NCBA and PLC is doing to go through the management plans and what the path forward looks like for us.
Sure thing. So this is a pretty wide-ranging proposal because what it actually is doing, we say the sage-grouse plans as kind of an umbrella term, but what's actually happening is an RMPA, a Resource Management Plan Amendment, that will impact 77 separate land use plans that are currently in place across 10 Western states. So these are done at a state-by-state level. They are supposed to be pretty locally focused and pretty landscape-specific, but we sometimes still see a little bit more of a top-down, one-size-fits-all approach than we would like. And then the other thing that's happening concurrently in this rulemaking is a draft EIS through the NEPA process for 6 alternatives, 6 varieties of plans for how the grouse will be managed going forward. So there's kind of a 2-track system that we're having to comment on now. Within those alternatives, there are a lot of changes to what management would look like on the ground. So there are some alternatives that are really restrictive towards oil and gas, for example. There are some that are pretty restrictive towards renewable energy. There are some that are more restrictive towards grazing. And then there are some that are a good balance of all of those things, plus some conservation measures to assist the bird and the sagebrush habitat. So we are going to be commenting during the comment period that's available here. I mentioned this is a really overarching proposal, and I think that's important to recognize because we've got more than 600 pages of documents now to parse through, courtesy of this rulemaking, and it's going to impact millions and millions of acres. This is a huge decision for Fish and Wildlife, for the BLM to make, and so we really want to make sure that we are seeing every angle here, and we think that needs more time. We think local stakeholders need more time. There's a lot of counties that want to get involved in this. Certainly state wildlife agencies have a stake in it, and then national stakeholder groups such as NCBA. So we are asking first and foremost for the BLM BLM to extend that comment period significantly. It's currently standing at 90 days. We believe it should be a minimum of 180. And then once we get that accomplished, we will obviously dig into writing some of those more technical comments about all of the different science that we have to support the fact that cattle improve the habitat, they improve the biomass of insect species that the sage grouse needs to eat, and they help prevent fire, which is a massive factor right now in loss of habitat for this species.
We will be back with Hunter and Sigrid in just a moment. This is the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson, and we'll be right back. You are listening to the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. Giving us livestock news today, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. We return with Hunter Ehrman.
Well, Sigrid, could you speak more to the relationship between grazing and sage grouse habitat?
Absolutely. So in the past, there was a pretty heavy misconception that cattle were a disturbance, a disruptor to sage grouse presence. Since then, in the last sort of 20 years or so, and particularly over the last 10 years with some new studies that have been undertaken in Idaho, we've seen a real shift actually in the conclusions that conservationists are reaching about the role that cattle plays here. You can find successful sage grouse nesting sites, successful leks, in pretty close proximity to cattle, in some cases right on top of them in the same pastures where folks are grazing. You see them travel pretty well across fence lines. They don't seem to be too bothered by that. And you see them having really good survivability rates in the areas where cattle have been present, because cattle, through their mechanical disturbance of the soil with their hooves, through the fertilizer that they're adding to the ground through manure, and through the grazing pattern that they're employing in a permittee situation where obviously that grazing on public lands is pretty carefully restricted and pretty carefully managed, we're seeing really big improvements in the biodiversity of plants, for example, that you can find in a certain area, the biodiversity of insect species that you find in a certain area. And that diversity, that sort of restoration of native rangeland with ungulate grazing is a really key sort of starting point for sage grouse success. It's kind of where all of their other life activities stem from. So we found really good science to support that cattle and the bird can coexist. You always used to hear, in previous years when we were working on this, they'd say what's good for the herd is good for the bird and vice versa. I would say that conclusion has only gotten stronger over the years as we've had more studies completed.
Sigrid, I'd like to shift and talk about some other species, including predator species. What is the latest on the gray wolf delisting?
Yeah, so this is one that we should have heard something in February, and surprise, surprise, the federal government did not get their homework done on time. So we were expecting a gray wolf delisting rule in February of 2024. The Fish and Wildlife Service has blown past that deadline and has indicated that they need more time to get this done. We're disappointed that they couldn't get it done in the ample time, the year that was allotted previous to this, but if they say they need more time, that's kind of where we're at. We're at a little bit of an impasse there. So we are still awaiting a completion of that delisting rule. The service is currently working on, to our knowledge, a species status assessment for the lower 48 population. They have completed smaller subsets of that, most recently for the Western DPS and the Northern Rocky Mountains population. Those status assessments yielded the same conclusion that we've seen for several years here now, and that's very supported by the science. It is not warranted to list those DPSs under the ESA. And we think that the more populations that the service looks at in other parts of the country, and certainly evaluating wolves as a whole across the lower 48, they're going to arrive at the same conclusion, and they're going to say we don't have reason to support an ESA listing of this species anymore. It's time to delist. We're obviously going to keep pushing forward with our court case. We're not going to put all of our eggs in the regulatory basket, but we do expect to get a favorable outcome there sometime before the end of 2024. The other item that I want to touch on with wolves that I think is pretty interesting and newsworthy in the last couple of weeks here is we got a recent population survey back for the previous year, 2023, on the Mexican gray wolf population. And this is a 10J population. It's a non-essential experimental population under the ESA of gray wolves found in Arizona and New Mexico. There's a lot of debate back and forth about how genetically distinct those two groups are now that there's been a lot of mixing between them, but the fish counts them as a separate population. So the Mexican gray wolf population in those two states has increased for the 8th year in a row. This is a really solid sign that that population has a strong foothold, more than a foothold in the landscape. And we've seen that reflected in the fact that conflicts are growing. There's a lot more depredation that producers are experiencing in that area. And so we're going to continue to push also for lifted protections for the gray wolf, but specifically with an eye towards, with that experimental population where there's a little bit more management flexibility, how do we deal with depredation now that that's becoming a much more common occurrence?
Sigrid, a couple of months ago, we talked about the Biden administration having a plan to introduce bears in the North Cascades ecosystem in Washington state. And I understand that there's a similar reintroduction effort underway in Montana and Idaho. What's the latest there?
Yeah, so just this week, in fact, we're wrapping up a scoping period, which is sort of a prelude to a full rulemaking that the agency does, in this case, Fish and Wildlife Service, when they're considering a new action. The one that they're looking at now in this scoping period is a reintroduction of more grizzly bears to the Bitterroot ecosystem. This is one of the designated grizzly bear recovery areas in the country. There's a couple. There's the GYE, the Greater Yellowstone. There's the North Cascades that you mentioned in Washington State that's gotten a lot of attention lately. And then the Bitterroot sort of spans the border of Idaho and Montana, and is actually one of two systems that impact Idaho. Idaho also has a decent chunk of the Selkirk ecosystem. But this effort to drop more bears into the Bitterroot is going to create a lot of the same problems that we identified in the North Cascades. It is also very strenuously opposed by local stakeholders on the ground, rural families, ranchers who don't want to deal with depredation, folks who are concerned about their safety and their family's safety, and so on and so forth. What I think is pretty interesting is that from the Fish and Wildlife Service's perspective, we're seeing this effort to spread out bears all over the country, all over the Northeast and the Northwest and the Upper Plains region, even in cases where it doesn't really make a lot of sense for the recovery of the species. And so when you look at this most recent idea that they've had for the Bitterroot, we've already gotten a lot of questions about why are they doing this? Is this going to lead to better outcomes for the species? And I think more than anything, what's motivating this is the fact that they have too many bears in the Greater Yellowstone. They have so many bears. They have become such a success story that they actually have to remove some and plop them into other ecosystems. So once again, I think this is an action that we can pretty firmly interpret as indicating that the bear is no longer in need of ESA protections, not that we need to double down on protections. They are reproducing, they are spreading out, they are traveling great distances. This is another predator species that is really well and truly recovered, and I think the actions that Fish and Wildlife is contemplating really need to catch up to reflect that.
Thank you again to the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. This is the AgNet News Hour, and we will be back in just a moment with more agriculture news. Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. Coming up in a few moments, we'll have today's This Land of Ours report, but first, more of the day's agriculture news. And with today's AgNet West headlines, here's AgNet West Farm News Director Brian German.
AgWest Farm Credit, a result of the merger between Farm Credit West and Northwest Farm Credit Services, has announced robust financial results for 2023. With a net income of nearly $708 million, surpassing projections, and total capital reaching $5.6 billion, the association demonstrates its capacity to support customers' borrowing needs. Total loan volume increased to $29.2 billion by December 31st of 2023. President and CEO Mark Littlefield attributes the success to the association's commitment to customer return on equity, capital growth, and community investment. AgWest also allocated over $6.7 million to support community needs, including development, youth programs, research, veterans, and crisis situations. With approximately $32 billion in total assets, AgWest serves customers across 7 western states. The Conservation Reserve Program's been an important resource for producers for nearly 40 years. Undersecretary for Farm Production and Conservation Robert Bonney highlighted the evolution and value of the CRP.
It's a program where we pay to idle marginal cropland, and we now can enroll grasslands as well. And we basically pay an annual rental fee for 10 to 15 years and do some conservation practices on those lands to improve them for wildlife and water quality and other benefits. So it's a way to partner with folks in agriculture to conserve lands, and even while we maintain those lands for future agricultural use. We would encourage people to go into their county offices to talk to folks there about both the general CRP, but also there may be some continuous enrollments that would be attractive to them as well. We've got a grasslands program. We're enrolling grasslands. That's a working lands program, so we can keep those lands in livestock production even while we provide environmental benefits.
The California Department of Food and Agriculture has announced 3 vacancies on the Feed Inspection Advisory Board Technical Advisory Subcommittee. The subcommittee advises on animal food nutrition, safety and efficacy data review of new and unapproved feed ingredients, research project oversight, and other issues. That insight is used in the application of regulatory programs, including the Livestock Drug Program, the Safe Animal Feed Education Program, and the Commercial Feed Regulatory Program. Applicants should demonstrate expertise in the fields of toxicology, nutrition, pathology, and knowledge of the California feed industry. The term is 3 years with no compensation but reimbursement for travel expenses. Interested individuals must submit a resume and prospective member appointment questionnaire by March 25th to be considered for one of the vacancies. I'm Brian German for AgNet West Radio Network.
A new way to protect important pollinators. That's coming up on This Land of Ours. Scientists at USDA's Agricultural Research developed an edible antiviral treatment that can be used to protect honeybees against deformed wing virus. Honeybees are important agricultural pollinators. However, viruses, including DWV, are linked to the deaths of millions of colonies worldwide. These colony losses devastate beekeeping industries and pose a major risk to agriculture and the global food supply. While there are medicines for other bee diseases and parasites, there's currently no treatment available to help beekeepers reduce viruses in their colonies. Researchers found that engineered algae diets suppressed DWV infection and improved survival in honeybees. When mixed into bee food, the engineered algae boosts the bee's immune system to fight off targeted viruses. The researchers filed a patent application for the technology and plan to use variations of it to target additional bee viruses and other pathogens in future studies. What is the forecast for milk production, product demand, prices for this year? Rod Bain reports.
What might 2024 have in store for dairy producers? Agriculture Department dairy analyst Michael McConnell offered an outlook for the dairy sector at this year's USDA Ag Outlook Forum.
Overall, we see milk production projected to continue growing, but at a decreasing rate from what we've seen in recent years. Beef prices are projected to be lower in the upcoming year, but we're expecting tighter global markets for dairy products, which are going to provide price support.
Specifically, strong demand for dairy products here and abroad.
We're projecting higher exports, particularly on a fat basis, while domestic use on skim solids basis is lower year over year. It's also worth noting that at over 180 billion pounds, it remains at a relatively elevated level relative to what we've seen in the past 5 years or so. So overall, demand both domestic and for exports, we're expecting to be relatively robust in the upcoming year.
In terms of how this translates into projected milk category and class prices for 2024.
We're forecasting prices coming off of the recent lows that we saw in 2023 and increasing a bit. However, they're not quite as high as the highest prices we've seen in the past 3 years.
So the breakdown of the forecast for this year's milk product prices include
butter and non-fat dry milk. Butter, not projecting prices to spike quite as high as saw the past couple of years, but still pretty strong seasonal movement in the butter price. And NDM, a steady increase in improvement from previous year. Cheese is the one dairy product we're actually expecting year over year prices to be lower. We're expecting the price to come up a bit from the recent lows that we've seen in the past couple months.
And with stronger prices expected across milk products,
we're expecting class prices to be higher year over year as well. We expect the class 4 price to remain higher than the class 3. The value of butter and NDM continue to be relatively higher than the historical standards compared to cheese and whey.
With 2024's all milk price expected to be up 43 cents from the previous year at $20.95 per hundredweight. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
This is the AgNet News Hour. We will be back in just a moment with more agriculture news. Welcome back. Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack gave the keynote address at this week's AgriPulse Food and Ag Summit in Washington, D.C. In his opening comments, he talked about the export and import trade deficit and the loss of farms in the U.S.
We've had record years in exports. They're concerned that imports are now in excess of our exports. There's a reason for that, and I'm not sure that we would necessarily want to substitute what's going on in this country with any other country in terms of our economy. Our economy is a lot stronger than any other developed country in the world. Inflation is down at a lower rate than any place in a developed world. Income and wages are up. Employment at historic levels. Unemployment at historic lows. And so it stands to reason that a strong economy will result in the rest of the world wanting to do business in the U.S. So these are concerns. These are things we work on every single day at USDA, but they're not necessarily the thing that keeps me up at night. Here's what does. The knowledge that on 544,000 occasions over the last 40 years or so, families had had to sit around a coffee table in a living room and basically make the decision that they could no longer farm. We've lost 544,000 farms since 1981. Just to give you a sense of how many farms that is, that's every farm today that exists in North Dakota and South Dakota, added to those in Wisconsin and Minnesota, added to those in Iowa and Illinois, added to those in Nebraska and Colorado, added to those in Oklahoma and Missouri. We've lost 151 million acres of land that was at one point in time in farming that's not being farmed today. That's the entire land mass of Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Maryland, and a good part of Virginia. So my question to myself is, am I okay with that as the Secretary of Agriculture? Are we as a country okay with it? And it occurs to me that we shouldn't be okay with it, because at the heart of rural America, and I think at the heart of a very important value system in America, is the family farm. The small and mid-sized producer who has two goals in life. He or she wants to farm, and he or she wants to be able to turn on that opportunity to the next generation. Those are the two passions that move people out in the countryside.
In the question and answer segment afterward, AgriPulse President and CEO Sarah Wyant asked Secretary Vilsack how the nation can turn trade around. Here is his response.
Well, first of all, we do have a stronger economy, which means that the rest of the world is looking, they don't have quite the demand in the rest of the world, so they're looking for market opportunities. They see a strong U.S. economy. We have a strong dollar, which oftentimes makes it a little bit more difficult. So the question is, how much of that do we want to give away? All right, well, most people would like to keep the strong economy, keep the high employment, keep the low unemployment. So that's a challenge. Secondly, let's take a look at what it is that's creating the difference. Some of it is horticulture. Some of it is sugar. And so then you ask your question about the sugar. Do we want to keep food prices down? So having more sugar come in to basically meet the demand of an American public that continues to consume that product, that's an issue. So understanding the dynamics of this, I think ought to make people a little bit less concerned about it, and plus the fact we've had exports at record levels. Having said that, I think what most people would say is, well, golly, we need free trade agreements. I'll bet you might have had some member of Congress say that. They send me letters about this all the time. They say, Secretary, we need free trade agreements. And I say to them this: have you passed? Did I miss it? Did you pass a fast track authority? Did that pass? Because if it didn't pass, it means that 535 members of the House and the Senate can amend any trade agreement you negotiate. Now, folks, put yourself in that position. Let's say I'm negotiating with you, Dan. And you know that the deal I make with you isn't the final deal because 535 people can amend it. What kind of deal are you going to make with me? So Trade Promotion Authority is a kind of a prerequisite to talking about free trade agreements. Having said that, there are ways that you can reduce barriers, and we are reducing barriers and expanding access. We increased the tariff quota in Japan for beef. We reduced tariffs in Vietnam for a variety of products, and we continually work on that. And the reason we're doing this, and the reason we're focused on the biotech issue in Mexico, and the reason why we continue to push Canada on dairy, is so that we can build a better sense of trust in trade in the United States. I suspect because this is an ag meeting that most of the people in this room think trade is great. But if you go out and talk to the folks out on the street in any city or town, they're going to tell you that trade isn't necessarily a good deal for the United States. Because over time, we haven't done the job of selling trade as a benefit to consumers with choice, as a benefit to keeping costs down, as a job creator. People see it as a job killer. And so if you're going to get trade promotion authority, you're going to get free trade agreements through the process, you have to rebuild people's trust in trade. You do that by doing two things. One, you enforce trade agreements that you already have, and you show people you're serious about them, which we're doing. And then two, you look for opportunities to chip away at the barriers that do exist and celebrate it when you can. And I have a list over the last 3 years of nearly $21 billion of ways in which markets were either kept open or we were able to expand markets because of chipping away at a tariff, chipping away at export quota to be able to provide more opportunity for U.S. products. So, I think it's important to have a comprehensive and thoughtful conversation about this. Too often we have a political conversation about it. And that just feeds the mistrust about trade. And what I'm trying to do is basically say, let's take a step back. Let's see why we're in the current circumstance. Understand the dynamics of the global economy. Wouldn't want to see the American economy not be the best performing economy in the world, as it is. Wouldn't want to see jobs lost. At the same time, there are things we are doing, and happy to work with Congress when and if they think they can get a trade promotion authority bill through, but I haven't seen anybody propose that.
This is the AgNet News Hour. We will be back in just a moment with more agriculture news. Welcome back to the AgNet News Hour. Here's Brian German with this week's Almond Update.
In this week's Almond Update from the Almond Board of California, President and CEO of the Central California Almond Growers Association, Michael Kelly, joined the Almond Journey podcast to share insights about the challenges with the 2023 crop with Almond Journey podcast host Tim Hammerich.
Today, we're going to take you back to the Almond Conference 2023, where I had the chance to sit down with Michael Kelly, President and CEO of Central California Almond Growers Association. Central California Almond Growers is the largest almond wholesaler operation in the world. They are an ag services co-op with around 380 farmer members from northern Kern County all the way up to Merced and east-west across the entire valley. Michael first appeared on this podcast back in episode 42, and today he returns to talk about some of the challenges with the 2023 crop, especially the major problems with navel orangeworm damage. We discuss some of the factors that led to it being such a difficult year for this pest damage and what to watch out for in the future. Also, he's involved with a really interesting project to try to help with navel orangeworm management. And it's always great to hear the perspective in general of a wholesaler about where the industry's heading and how things might be able to be improved. So enjoy this Almond Conference 2023 interview with Michael Kelly.
This year was by far the oddest and strangest season that I think I've ever encountered. This is my 19th year. I came from the cotton industry, but in my 19 years, I've never seen one that's been plagued with so much adversity. And it's heart-wrenching, from the farmer level. We started off with a very poor pollination period because we had high amounts of rain, which we badly needed. And that prevented growers from going in and doing their normal in-field sanitation, which has been proven this year that it's absolutely necessary. That ended up causing a lower yield. Pest pressures became very large with less almonds to go to. And that really showed up with navel orangeworm. Navel orangeworm levels are like I have never seen. Because remember, we had 2 rain events also, remnants of 2 hurricanes that were moving across the Pacific, far away from us, but they were subtropical depressions when they came into California. One was in late August, one was in mid-September, and both of those caused product to stay out in the field a lot longer than it normally would, thereby also causing pest pressure to increase to pretty significant levels. We actually saw live worms coming in from the field. It was just really, really a bad year.
Had you ever seen that before?
No. We always get some level of live worms, but it's very, very small. Yeah. And then there's small worms that have just hatched. This year, we actually saw large worms, which means they had been feeding for quite a long time. So it goes to everything this year, the timeliness of what the growers could do. We were hampered by what we could do. Everything as far as timing was just flawed. And then you add to that the situation with the growers with almond pricing being so low. They did not have the money to do field sanitation, many of them. And then when it came time for them to spray, many elected not to spray. And that really cost a lot in the end.
So in some cases, was it that, hey, I can cut costs a little bit on sanitation and hope it's not a bad year, and then it turned out to be a horrible year?
Yes, it was like a perfect mix of everything that could go wrong to make that navel orange worm get just to monumental levels.
And as far as the growers that did do effective sanitation, obviously everybody had a problem, but it was noticeable in the damage.
Well, I'm really glad you asked that question, because where we know that growers did everything right, their levels were extremely low. I mean, I'm speaking of one grower. I won't tell you his name. He's a small grower. He did everything right. He had 2 truckloads of nonpareil that came in. They're at like a 0.3 and 1.3 for navel orange worm. I use him as an example because there's a myriad of other growers that were larger growers that we experienced the exact same thing. It's the difference between night and day, how important the infield sanitation is post-harvest and the need to do those well-timed applications for pests when it's needed. And a lot of times, remember, with those pests, it's not when you actually think you're ready to go. It's actually a few days. It can be, 2-3 days actually before that, because of the situation where you have to make sure that it's timed for things that might be happening in the field that you don't know about yet. It's crucial that growers understand that timing, which is well publicized with the University of California Extension Service.
Yeah. Wow. And what types of, levels of navel orange worm damage were you seeing this year?
We saw anywhere from 10 to 20%. And I got to be real honest with you. So what's that mean? If you have a 10% damage on almonds, when we run it through the huller sheller, that number doubles. So when it came into us, the almonds actually were at 20%. We got 10% out. That went to our hash bin. And then we prettied up the grower product. And this is kind of another interesting story. I'm really proud of what we did with the cleanup job on grower product. But one of the reasons that we were able to help them from a quality standpoint in getting the damaged out is because the product was so damaged. And remember, the primary tool in an almond sheller is air. So we were able to aspirate out a lot of that product because there's a weight differential. In the almond hulling business, everything's based on weight. So the more that we can blow out, the more that we can protect the good product. So if you have that disparity between light and heavy, we're able to aspirate the light out. And why is it light? Because it was so chewed up, we were able to blow it out. So that helped. I mean, we were able to make that separation and be able to, in most cases, be able to deliver a quality product to the growers. Albeit by quality, I mean that most of it on a Blue Diamond standard was, better than 60% was S1, which is the lowest grade you can have. But we were able to present a product to them that was saleable.
Again, this was just a portion of the Almond Journey podcast with CCAGA's Michael Kelly. You can listen to the entire podcast and other episodes by searching Almond Journey wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Brian German for AgNet West Radio Network.
We'll be right back. You are listening to the AgNet News Hour. Now for more news, the 2024 Feeding the Economy report shows agriculture's economic impact in the United States. Michael Clements shares the details.
The 2024 Feeding the Economy report demonstrates the broad reach of the U.S. agricultural sector, drilling down to the state and congressional district level. Roger Cryan, American Farm Bureau Federation chief economist, says the report spans the entire agricultural supply chain.
It's an effort to put together the impact of agriculture on the economy. The report goes over the impact of agriculture upstream and downstream. And of course, farmers are at the heart of that, but it starts with the folks that supply farmers and goes all the way out to the folks that eat.
The report finds that agriculture accounts for more than 1/3 of the entire U.S. economy.
The direct impact of the food supply chain from farm to retail was about 24 million jobs, about $990 billion in wages, and $3.8 trillion in economic activity. When you add in the multiplied impacts, it's more than doubled to 49 million jobs and $2.8 trillion in wages and $9.6 trillion in economic activity.
Cryan says the report is a key tool for advocating on behalf of agriculture, especially when it comes to the Farm Bill.
The agricultural supply chain is everywhere. It's critically important to the economy, let alone how important it is just to feed and clothe people. Numbers like this can help drive home to everybody in every state the importance to them of the agricultural economy and why it's so important to recognize that we need a farm bill to support that enormous engine for economic activity.
Find the report at feedingtheeconomy.com. Michael Clements, Washington.
The U.S. winter of 2023-2024 is now the warmest winter season on record, per NOAA climatic data going back 130 years. Rod Bain reports.
The warmest winter in the United States on record?
Winter rankings, the United States, specifically the lower 48 states, coming in with its warmest winter on record. These records go back 130 years, all the way to 1895.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey says those National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration average temperature numbers for this winter continue a recent trend.
If you look at those 130 years, now all 13 of the warmest winters have occurred since 1990, just in the last 35 years.
Rippey adds the gap between the top two all-time winter average high temperatures are not close from a climate perspective.
The winter U.S. average temperature of 37.6 degrees Fahrenheit was almost 5.4 degrees above what the average was during the 20th century, and that broke the previous record, which had been set in 2015-16, by more than 0.8 of a degree. In the realm of climate, not even close to the previous record. And number 3, now dropping to the list, 1999-2000.
The above normal warmth this winter occurred
despite a very sharp cold outbreak that occurred for about 10 days in the middle of February. But other than that 10 days, the other 90 plus days of winter, it was extremely warm, especially across the northern and the central United States.
With December 2023 reaching an all-time average record high temperature for that month, and despite the cold outbreak, February 2024 coming in as the third warmest February on record. The state-by-state breakdown further reflects just how warm on average the winter of 2023-24 has been.
It was the warmest winter on record for 8 individual states, and that included Iowa plus 7 Canadian border states extending from North Dakota to Vermont. We also saw impressively top 10 winter rankings in almost all other U.S. states. The only exceptions were New Mexico, Arizona, and Washington in the west, and then a handful of southeastern states extending from Arkansas and Louisiana eastward to the Atlantic coast, to the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida. So other than that little block of states in the southeast and New Mexico, Arizona, Washington, it was one of the 10 warmest winters on record.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
That's today's top agriculture news. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. Thank you for sharing your morning with us.
To get more information on the topics you heard today, visit AgNet West online at agnetwest.com. You can also stay connected by following us on our social media at AgNet West on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also find our broadcast team of Brian German and Sabrina Halvorson on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you for listening to the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. AgNet West Radio Network, your primary choice for agriculture news.